One of the things that struck me working on this story is the sheer tenacity of some of the people involved. The tenacity it takes to keep digging for answers that have long been buried, or perhaps hidden. There's a kind of recklessness to it. Take Mikhael Trepashkin, the FSB investigator turned whistleblower we talked about in the last episode. Two of his colleagues investigating the apartment bombs end up dead. One shot outside his house, the other dying in mysterious circumstances. But what does Trepashkin do? He keeps digging.
He's just sort of a remarkable figure in that one after another, people around him are getting killed, and yet he keeps going.
And for Scott Anderson, the American journalist who interviewed him, the precariousness of Trepashkin's world only became clear once he stepped inside it.
In fact, it's kind of funny. I had a number of meetings with Trepashkin. One of the last ones was at his apartment. And as I discovered when I got there, he very rarely would meet outsiders in his apartment. He said, I'm only doing this because my wife is out running errands. And if she knew I was meeting with the foreign journalist, she'd be furious. And the funny thing was that his wife actually came back early while I was still there. And she kicked us out of the house.
Not surprised.
Yeah. So we had finished our interview in the park.
Mikhael Trepashkin's wife had good reason to be scared. She'd seen what happened to him at the time of the apartment bombing trial, how his big plan to derail it had all gone horribly wrong. From the BBC, I'm Helena Merriman, and this is the History Bureau, Putin and the Apartment Bombs. Episode 6, The Trial. It's October 2003, 4 years after the 4 Russian apartment buildings exploded in the night, killing some 300 people. And the government's finally about to start a trial to prosecute 2 of the men they say carried out the attacks. But some people think they had the wrong guys, like Mikhael Trepashkin, who's convinced something doesn't add up. Remember, Trepashkin's been working on the independent commission investigating the apartment bombs. And he thinks he's found a damning piece of evidence that could disrupt the trial. It's a drawing of one of the suspected bombers. According to the FSB, it shows the mastermind behind the attacks. But Trepashkin stumbled across something odd. This FSB sketch isn't the same as the original police drawing of the suspected bomber, the one printed in a newspaper back in 1999. That original sketch looks like someone else. In fact, Trepashkin thinks it looks like an FSB agent, someone that he recognises from his days inside the FSB. He thinks the picture's been swapped. And now Trepashkin's planning to present this evidence at the government's trial, to argue that there's been an FSB cover-up. But first, he has someone to meet. A few days before the trial starts, he gathers his evidence, sketches and newspaper clippings, and he heads to the editorial office of Moscow News.
He meets with a Russian journalist and he shares his information of his suspicions of the case and says, I want to go to the trial and I want to present this evidence there. If anything happens to me, you'll know why.
Was this backup? Do you think he had a sense that something might happen?
Yes. Frankly, he would have been a fool not to. He'd already been arrested once. They had these charges hanging over him. And he was stepping on the third rail of Vladimir Putin's rise to power.
By asking hard questions about the bombs, Trepashkin was digging into Vladimir Putin's origin story. Remember, after the attacks on the apartments, Putin went from a political nobody, a grey mouse as many Russians called him, to president in just a few months. And 4 years on, as the trial approached, there was no longer any trace of that grey mouse. Putin was firmly in control.
At the time, Putin was surprisingly popular. He had surprised people by how vigorous he was a leader.
This is Stephen Lee Myers. He was the Moscow bureau chief for the New York Times at the time of the trial.
Putin had largely reconquered Chechnya and brought it back under Russian control. And voters, loved that. And that made him a very popular leader. The economy and oil prices were helping Russia at the time. And so you started to see some of the economic growth come back after the financial crisis in the 90s. So I think Putin was, I would say, riding high.
And at this point, there was huge interest all over the world in understanding more about Putin. And so in autumn 2003, early in his posting to Moscow, Stephen Lee Myers thought he should meet him.
As a new bureau chief, I had thought, well, you should interview the head of the country.
And Putin agreed to a sit-down interview with Stephen and his executive editor. But first, the Kremlin asked for a primer on Stephen's newspaper, the New York Times.
So I just kind of made up a memo, kind of Wikipedia version of, the history of the Sulzberger family buying it. It was founded in 1851. Said all the nice things I think about the New York Times. And when the interview began, he addressed the executive editor and talked about how the New York Times is run as this public institution and it's such a great thing. I mean, he was literally just reading off the memo that I had written.
So he'd done his homework.
He had done his homework, but I hadn't told the executive editor this. So he came away thinking, my gosh, look how prepared, Putin really knows his stuff. And, the fact is he does. And that can be charming to people. I think it can also be intimidating. There's the famous story of when he brought his dog in to meet Angela Merkel, knowing that she was afraid of dogs. And so, it can cut both ways.
Putin the charmer, Putin the intimidator, always in control. But during Stephen's first interview with him, there were moments where Putin's mask began to slip. Certain subjects seemed to rattle him.
He would always get very testy about questions about Chechnya, particularly. I also asked him, because I was dying to, about his KGB career, and was there anything that he regretted about it? Because there are still rumors about what exactly he did when he was a KGB officer.
And what did he say?
He has this stock answer. He reminds people that George H.W. Bush was the head of the CIA before he became president. So, he's still kind of defensive about it in a weird way.
What should we make of Putin's defensiveness? Was it just irritation at what he saw as Western hypocrisy? Or the frustration of a man who wanted to move on, to stop answering uncomfortable questions? Questions about the war in Chechnya and about his past in the KGB. Because at this point, in 2003, the world is still trying to work him out, wondering who Vladimir Putin really is and where he's taking Russia. So you arrived almost 3 years after the apartment bombings. Were they still a big story at that point?
Absolutely. There were opposition parties who were asking hard questions about this. There were people who were trying to find out what happened. But given everything that was happening, it wasn't the top story. So we were all busy doing other things as well. When I first arrived in the aftermath of these bombings, the debate could still rage on. But the war hung over everything.
He's referring to the second war with Chechnya that began at the time of the apartment bombs.
The country was at war with itself, with the Chechens in the south, and there were enormous losses on both sides.
From the perspective of a reporter who'd arrived on the scene in those years, the idea that Chechen militants had bombed those 4 apartments wasn't far-fetched. If anything, the violence of Chechen militants was growing ever more apparent.
There was an increasing radicalization of the Chechen movement, and there were terrorist attacks that grew out of that.
There was one particularly horrific attack that Stephen covered shortly after he arrived in Russia. It happened a year before the apartment bombing trial, and it's worth going back to it because it changed how many Russians saw the Chechens and what they were capable of.
It was on my first break from Russia. I was in France, and I flew back immediately and saw this horrific scene.
It all began on October the 23rd, 2002. Almost 1,000 people were sitting in a theatre 5 miles from the Kremlin in Moscow, watching a musical. The second act had just begun, actors tap dancing and singing. when a masked man in camouflage walked out onto the stage.
An entertaining night out at a Moscow theatre. Then, the moment comedy turned to tragedy. A Chechen gunman bursts onto the stage, shouting at the actors to get off.
At first, the audience thought it was all just part of the show. But then it dawned on them. They'd been taken hostage.
These pictures were apparently taken by the Chechens themselves, filming what the Russians call one of the most audacious terrorist acts the world has known.
The videos show women in black hijabs sitting amongst the audience, bombs strapped to their chests. Meanwhile, Chechen gunmen walk along the aisles, sealing the exits. The demand was simple. Russian troops must leave Chechnya, or they'd kill everyone in the theatre.
They seized the building and held hostages for 3 days.
Eventually, the militants released some of the hostages, mostly children, but hundreds were still trapped inside. At one point, one of the women hostages managed to phone a local radio station. Can you hear us? She asked. We're all going to be blown to hell. Then the line went dead. Over the next few days, there were attempts to negotiate with the Chechen militants. When that failed, Russian special forces did something no one expected.
I saw this horrific scene of the Russian security forces, after failing to negotiate, pumping gas into the building, which seemed like a brilliant idea. You just knock everybody out, except that it suffocated some of the people who were inside that they were trying to save.
At 5 a.m. on the third day of the siege, Russian commandos stormed the theatre and discovered the horrific consequences of what they'd done.
The cost of their liberation was high. The car park outside the theatre became a makeshift hospital and mortuary. Many of the hostages were killed during the operation.
130 hostages died during the siege. Most suffocated from the mystery gas pumped into the theatre by Russian special forces.
And I remember being really struck at the time Putin came out and apologized. Like, Putin never apologizes for anything. But he said we couldn't save everyone. I'm sorry.
The relief of the surviving hostages was mirrored today in the face of the Russian President Vladimir Putin as he visited them in hospital. But there are still many questions unanswered. How could this happen? And where will the rebels strike next?
That question, how could this happen, still hasn't been answered, even now, over 20 years later. But at the time, the main takeaway for Russians was that here they were again, being attacked by Chechen militants.
It's not to excuse anything the Russian state has done or to blame Chechnya for everything, but there were some bad terrorists who were at war with Russia at this time. I mean, Chechen terrorists, and they were Chechens, were able to leave the Caucasus, cross hundreds and hundreds of miles to get to Moscow, and then lead a heavily armed siege of a musical.
And so, the way many Russians looked at it, if Chechen militants had the brutality and ingenuity to pull off a siege in Moscow, then it wasn't a leap to think they could have bombed those 4 buildings back in '99. So, by the time of the government's trial of the accused apartment bombers, a lot of people had already reached a conclusion. It was Chechen militants. But given that, there's something very odd about this trial.
You know, one of the things that struck me at the time is that none of the people that were arrested or accused officially were Chechens. None of the people seemed to be from Chechnya.
Which is pretty striking.
It is.
It's worth repeating that. None of the men arrested or accused in relation to the apartment bombs were Chechen. That's despite the government's insistence that Chechen militants were to blame, and despite Vladimir Putin launching airstrikes on Chechnya just days after the attacks. So if they weren't Chechen, who were they? Well, it's not a simple question to answer. The government didn't release many details about their investigation on the bombs, so we did some digging into news reports, FSB statements, and the picture's confusing. Let's take it bomb by bomb. So for the first bomb, the one that exploded after a football match in southern Russia, 8 men from Dagestan, a republic next to Chechnya, were arrested. Those men had already been tried in court in early 2000 and found guilty. For the next 3 bombs, the FSB named 9 suspects. Again, none were Chechen. Instead, they were from neighbouring republics in the Caucasus, a mountainous area that spanned southern Russia. But they weren't from Chechnya.
I will say that in the Caucasus at the time, there were Islamic movements in all of the republics. It was a kind of a pan-Caucasian Islamic movement against Russia.
By 2003, 7 of those 9 suspects were either dead or in hiding, which left 2 men remaining. 2 men that the government tracked down in Georgia, then brought back to Russia to stand trial. Tell me about the trial.
As I recall, the trial was not open to the press, so you couldn't go. It happened more behind the scenes.
And was that very common?
When it comes to national security cases, yes, it's pretty common.
Which takes us back to Mikhael Trepashkin, the former FSB investigator turned whistleblower. Remember, because Trepashkin's representing one of the victims' families, he's allowed to go to the trial, to present new evidence. And he's planning on revealing what he thinks is a smoking gun, his discovery of the swapped sketch.
He meets with a Russian journalist and he shares his information of his suspicions of the case.
Here's journalist Scott Anderson again.
And then just a few days after that, Trepashkin is arrested. His apartment is raided by the FSB with his wife and 2 daughters there. And this time he's hauled off to prison.
So when the trial begins, and for the 2 months it runs, Trepashkin is behind bars, in custody. There's no one else who can present the evidence he found. And so his big discovery about the swapped police sketch and his theory that the original drawing of the suspected bomber looks like an FSB agent, it's never heard in court. Trepashkin's been silenced. We'll never know exactly what happened behind closed doors in the trial. But when it ends, reporters are allowed inside to hear the verdict. Journalists look on as the 2 suspects stand side by side in a glass box, ready to be sentenced. The 2 men are found guilty of terrorism, murder, illegal trafficking in explosives, and a string of other charges in relation to 3 of the 4 bombs, the ones in Moscow and Volgodonsk. The judge says the men were following orders from Chechen rebels, and he sentences the men to life in a high-security prison. When the men hear their sentence, they smile. "Why are you in such a good mood?" a reporter later asks. "Because it's all lies," they say, and people laugh at lies. Outside the court, the men's lawyers tell reporters that their clients had admitted partial guilt, but only as middlemen. The men say they transported sacks of explosives to Moscow, thinking they were just bags of sugar. And that's it. The trial is over. The government announces the case closed and ends its criminal investigation into the apartment bombs. The files are then sealed, locked away for the next 75 years. As for Trepashkin, instead of disrupting the trial for the apartment bombs, he's now a suspect in his own trial, facing charges brought by the government.
So after he was arrested, he was tried in a closed court, no spectators.
The first charge, possession of an unlicensed gun, the judge quickly dismisses. But there's a second charge, which goes back to the raid on Trepashkin's apartment the previous year. Possession of classified FSB documents and some bullets. Bullets that Trepashkin insists were planted by the FSB. It's not much, but it's enough.
He was sentenced to 4 years in prison and sent off to a prison camp in the Ural Mountains.
So he'd made this huge gamble to take on this case. He'd found some extraordinary material, and then he's sent off to the middle of nowhere for 4 years.
That's right. Yeah.
In an article about the court case, a journalist describes how after Trepashkin heard his verdict, his wife walked to a corner of the courtroom, turned her face to the wall, and wept. Later she told reporters, everyone knew what he knew, but why did he go out and say it? It was so stupid of him.
Did he talk to you about what that was like?
It was a very harsh prison, and he was allowed very few visitors. I believe his wife came to see him twice.
In his prison diaries, Mikhael Trepashkin describes life in cell number 274. Prisoners had to take turns sleeping. When they weren't sleeping, they had to stand. There wasn't even room to sit. At one point, a journalist visited Trepashkin and asked if he was afraid. He said, "Yes, I am afraid. I'm afraid my children will grow up in a country without basic human rights. And I don't want them to be ashamed because their father stayed silent while the government destroyed the country." Meanwhile, as Trepashkin counts out the days in prison, in March 2004...
Now to Russia, where Vladimir Putin has won a landslide victory in the country's presidential election. But it wasn't exactly a triumph for democracy. That's according to the international observers who monitored the vote.
Vladimir Putin wins a second term as president. It's a landslide victory. He's won more than 70% of the vote. Russian state TV calls it a vote for stability. But international observers see something else. An election that was stacked from the start.
Mr. Putin has swept to a second term, but the Bush administration says under him authoritarian ways are creeping back to Russia, adding Mr. Putin's election wasn't fully democratic. In reply, Russia's president said he'd watched in amazement the failures in America's presidential elections 4 years ago, and they should perfect their own procedures before criticizing his.
With his victory, Vladimir Putin's grip tightens, and a new phase of his rule begins, more confident, more controlled. As for the apartment bombing story, the way the Kremlin handled it would become a template for how they managed future scandals too. When crises came, plane crashes, bombings, submarine disasters, the pattern would be the same. Move fast to control the narrative, flood the media with official versions of events, and seal investigations before awkward questions can be asked. Step by step, the message became clear. Not just for ordinary Russians, but to its journalists, judges, and investigators. Some truths are too dangerous to pursue. But there's one final twist in Mikhael Trepashkin's story. Something which shows just how far this fear of Russian retaliation had spread. It's something that happened to Scott Anderson after his reporting trip to Russia, the one where he met Trepashkin. Back in the US, Scott wrote up his story. And a few months later, in September 2009, exactly 10 years after the apartment bombs, Scott's piece appeared in GQ magazine.
The title was "None Dare Call It a Conspiracy," the subtitle of who was behind the 1999 Moscow apartment bombings that accelerated Vladimir Putin's rise to power.
So pretty punchy.
Pretty punchy. Yeah, pretty punchy.
And you'd expect a big reaction.
That's right. I expected quite a reaction. Instead, it was crickets.
I've read the piece. It reads like a thriller, charting every twist and turn of the apartment bombs in Trepashkin's story. It's well-researched, provocative, the kind of article that would normally get a lot of clicks.
But what was curious to me is that there was no mention of the article on the website.
So it appeared in the magazine and print, but not online.
Not online.
It made no sense to Scott. GQ had commissioned the story, published it in their magazine, so why not promote it properly? So he started asking around.
I was given this email that was from the chief law firm representing Condé Nast to all the leadership of Condé Nast and to the top editors of GQ.
Condé Nast is the media company that owns and publishes GQ.
Can we get you to read some of it?
Let me see if I can pull it up. It says, Condé Nast Management has decided that the September issue of US GQ magazine containing Scott Anderson's article, Vladimir Putin's Dark Rise to Power, should not be distributed in Russia. To that end, the following steps should be taken. Number 1, subscription, newsstand, and other copies of the issue should not be sent to recipients in Russia. Number 2,
it's a long list of instructions, all to keep Scott Anderson's article out of Russia.
Number 4, the article should not be put on the GQ website nor on any website. Number 5, the article should not be put on or referred to on GQ's Facebook page, Twitter account, RSS feeds, iTunes.
And at the end of this long email, it simply says,
please feel free to call me to discuss.
Had anything like this happened to you ever before?
Never.
So what did you do?
So I actually went to the National Public Radio and said, look, this is what's happening.
And it became a news story.
Normally when a magazine gets a big scoop, it shouts it to the world. But apparently not GQ.
It was covered on NPR in September 2009 by reporter David Folkenflik.
Now, I'm looking now at the September issue with Michael Jackson on the cover, and there's stuff about anti-erotics, smoking hot bride, the 25 most obnoxious colleges. I don't see any mention of this. This is a significant international piece. I couldn't find it anywhere on the internet.
It caused a little mini scandal, and in fact, like censorship usually does, it backfired because a group of independent people in Russia translated the article and published it online in Russia.
We wrote to Condé Nast to ask them to explain what happened. They said, quote, "We cannot verify Mr. Anderson's recollections from events 16 years ago, but at that time, Condé Nast's international offices operated independently, and it was not standard practice to publish US content overseas. In addition to print publication in 2009, the article was published many years ago on GQ.com, where it remains available for anyone to read today." And it's true. In 2017, Scott's piece was finally published on GQ.com. But back in 2009, when it was first published, Scott's article barely made a ripple, just like David Satter's article 10 years earlier, when he'd raised the same unsettling questions about the apartment bombs. And just like the dozens of articles written by journalists inside Russia, questioning the official story. And so, eventually, over the years, this story went quiet. Yes, there were rumours about the apartment bombs, of something dark and twisted at play, but not many major news organisations took it on. Which brings us to our final episode. We're going back to the reporters in this show who chased the story from the very beginning. 25 years on, what do they think really happened?
I would say eat my hat if it turns out that the security services were not involved.
I would say that's a conspiracy theory. And I've read the evidence of journalists I respect who have come to a different conclusion. The timing doesn't work. The logic doesn't even work for me. But I know that there are people who believe that.
What's your take on it now? Who do you think plotted the bombs?
I'm not sure I'd give an answer. I think it's plausible that it was the FSB, but that's different from saying it was.
The History Bureau, Putin and the Apartment Bombs, is a BBC Studios production. Written and presented by me, Helena Merriman. The series producer is Sarah Shebier. Sound by Eloise Whitmore. And the executive editor is Annie Brown.